I find the summer really impacts my creativity when it comes to photography. I'm not much of a morning person, I'm rarely able to catch a sunrise, and sunsets are few and far between because that involves heading out late, which isn't always possible. But if you can relate with this, then you'll be happy to know that I have a few really fun and really creative solutions for you.
So today I want to carry on from last week's video, which was all around summer photography tips, and I want to talk a little bit more about some other ways you can make the most of your photography during these harsh, light, blue sky, potentially uninteresting days. And this kind of ties into some news that I wanted to share on the channel and just some things that are coming up for me in my photography. I'm working on a print collection at the minute, and I'm going to be exhibiting in a couple of galleries, hopefully this August, in my local area. And it's got me thinking about the distinction between photography and art, and where the two kind of overlap, and if they do overlap, then where does the distinction end? At what point does a photo become a piece of art? Is it a technique? Is it a subject? That's what I'm going to try and explore in this video. But like I mentioned, there are some techniques that I think can be used to demonstrate this point, and they're just things that you may not have tried. So we're going to experiment with some slightly more abstract forms of photography today. So my 2 cents worth is that pretty much all photography can be considered art. I mean, if you are creating something from nothing, then you are effectively a creative and therefore potentially an artist. And there are ways that you can make landscape photos appear more artistic. I mean, there's things like long exposure photography, especially in seascapes, that take static images that could be considered snapshots into something that's a little bit more artistic. And I think this is where the distinction between art and photography begins to cross over slightly. Now, I've come down to my local beach today. It's a pretty popular place during the summer, but there's not an awful lot of interesting things here other than this lighthouse that you can see over my shoulder, which is a really beautiful subject. But if you were to just take a photo of that lighthouse, then you're kind of just taking a snapshot. And is that considered art? I mean, I don't know. But I think for me, the definition that I like to use when it comes to, I guess, fine art photography or artistic photography is when you're taking an impression of the landscape rather than just taking a photo of the landscape. So let me explain what I mean by that. Now, taking an impression of the landscape is not the same as just taking a photo. A photo clearly depicts what the subject of that particular scene is, but in my definition, taking an impression of the landscape is more trying to evoke a sense of the mood, the drama, the atmosphere, the conditions in that location, and letting that be an integral and important subject within the frame. Now, there are a few different techniques that you can use to create this sort of effect and to create mood and drama and trying to convey the conditions. And the two that we're going to talk about today are intentional camera movement, or ICM photography, and something called multiple exposure photography. Now, I'm pretty new to both of these things, but they're just things that I've been really enjoying, especially when I've been trying to think about my photography in a slightly more artistic way. And the great thing about these two techniques is that on harsh, blue sky days in the summer, these are going to give you really good results because conditions and, light and interest, it doesn't necessarily matter as much because you're going to create the interest and the drama by how you're going to manipulate the camera, either by movement or by creating some artistic compositions by layering multiple images together. So in that respect, it's a bit of a godsend at this time of year. So the first technique that I want to talk about, and it's arguably the easiest one to do if you're wanting to do everything in camera, and that is using ICM, or intentional camera movement photography. And this is a good technique for, as I was saying, trying to convey the impression of a landscape as opposed to just the snapshot or the image of a landscape. So I'm trying to get an image of the lighthouse here, and I have these grasses and reeds just in the foreground, and as you can see, it's quite blustery. There's a lot of movement in the foreground and in this frame, and ICM photography is a great way to accentuate that movement within an image. So a couple of things to think about when you are looking to do ICM. Obviously we are doing this in the middle of the day, and I need to get a slow shutter speed to be able to get the motion blur that I want in this particular image. So because of that, I'm using a Case ND filter. I think I'm using a 6-dot filter for this because I'm trying to get, what are my settings here? I'm trying to get around sort of 1/20th of a second or thereabout. And all that means is that when I start moving the camera during the exposure, I'm going to start to get some of that blur, but this is just something that is trial and error. There are so many different, variables in between, even a 20th of a second, a 100th of a second, every small incremental change is going to make a difference in this particular frame. So all it is just a case of experimenting. So you're just going to frame up your shot. Composition is still important with ICM photography. It's not all about just blurring everything and making it look all painterly. You still need to think about composition and where you're placing your subjects, such as the lighthouse. But you do have a little bit more freedom, because then it's just a case of, as the shutter fires, you're just going to start to add some movement. And there's no real sort of technique for this. It's just literally experimentation, trial and error. But it's just really, really fun, and it takes your photography in a slightly different direction, and it's, a little bit more original. There are a lot of people who do ICM photography very successfully, but it's not something you see an awful lot of. So I'm going to put these photos up on screen now, and hopefully they've turned out all right. I mean, the main aim for me is just to kind of at least have the image make the point that I'm trying to convey in this video. So hopefully you can get an idea of what I mean. Now, ICM photography also works really well when you're trying to hone in on some more of the kind of intimate landscape detail. So things like these grasses, focusing in on those rather than just kind of pinpointing a big vista can really help create a more abstract effect. And if you zoom in on the sort of longer end of the focal length, so anything around sort of like 50 millimeters up to maybe 70 millimeters, 85, 90, just go slightly more telephoto, because the compression that you get in the scene just means any movement that you do is going to be exaggerated further. It really helps the effect. It's still possible with wide angle lenses, but I don't feel like the effect is quite as good. And it's really important to try not to make the entire scene all mushy. Sometimes that can work for abstract shots like this with the grasses, but when you have a very prominent subject, such as the lighthouse, you don't want to necessarily make that too blurry. Next, I'm going to talk about multiple exposure photography, and this differs slightly from the ICM photography we were doing in the last clip, but the results can be quite similar in so much that it gives you that very painterly, impressionistic viewpoint of a scene. Now, it does differ because you will need to be taking multiple exposures as opposed to just one image, and the way that you're going to do this differs slightly from the ICM approach as well, because you're going to be doing this at a much quicker shutter speed, because you do want everything to be in focus and sharp for this technique. Now, what you're going to do is you're going to take your camera, and it's important to be handheld when doing this, and you want to frame up your composition, and then for each exposure you're going to move your camera ever so slightly in the frame. What that's going to do is it's going to change the perspective ever so slightly, and then when you stack all of those images and merge them in Photoshop, that's what's going to give you that painterly look. And I will, when we get back home, show you the post-processing, workflow for this. But for now, I'm just going to frame up another composition with the lighthouse, and I'll put the image up on screen now. So let me quickly tell you how to edit these multiple exposure photographs. What you want to do is first do your base edits. So just get your images to a point where you're happy, and then import those photos as layers in Lightroom. Next, you're going to convert all of these layers into a smart object, and then what you're going to do is you're going to go up to your layer section in the top left toolbar, and then you're going to convert it, and you're going to blend those images using the mean
function or the mean tool. And all that is going to do is it's basically just going to merge all of those images together in an approximation of what the software thinks it should look like. And then you can adjust this further just using the brush tool or any color corrections, any final tweaks that you want to do to your final image. Now, coffee is something that I am very, very passionate about. I've been really into learning how to make good specialty coffee and espresso at home. And when I think about the best coffee that I've ever had, I rarely can remember things like the design on the takeaway cup or the latte art design that was poured onto that coffee. The things that I do remember are how it made me feel, the taste, the texture. It's all of those very kind of like indefinable emotional things that you get from experiencing something really great. That's the stuff. And this ties in to this whole debate around photography and art. And when you are looking at taking an impression of a landscape as opposed to a photo of the landscape, the comparisons can be drawn between that and something as tenuous as coffee. Because if you can evoke a feeling or an emotion in your photos that the viewers of those photos can then instantly resonate with, then I think you're on your way to being able to create really compelling art. And it takes your photo from being something that is just a nice image to something that I guess delves a little bit deeper into the more emotional side of us when we look at things like art. And that idea of capturing a feeling or trying to inject some emotion into an image, you know, there's lots of different ways that you can do that. Obviously, we've talked about ICM photography and multiple exposure photography today, but if we delve a little bit deeper into the post-processing side of those images, then that's where you can really start to be very experimental and very creative. When you think of summer, immediately you think of kind of bright, hot sunshine days with a very kind of like warm color palette almost. And that's what I tried to evoke in the images that I took today. The white balance was a lot warmer than it normally would be, but because I'm trying to convey that emotion, that's an artistic choice that I'm okay with, even if technically that isn't right in terms of what the eye and what the camera saw out in the field. Imperfection is all part of the process in creating this work. I mean, technically there are tons of things wrong with these images, but I do believe that they are compelling just because they are different. They make the viewer ask questions. It makes you, question what you're looking at. You don't typically see images in this way. You typically see, paintings in this form. And then it starts to make you think, well, am I looking at a photo or am I looking at a painting? And if you're making the viewer ask these questions, then I think that's a really, really good sign. And it's because of this abstract nature that I think this particular form of photography can be so great during the summer months because, rules are pretty much thrown out of the window. What was once considered a very undesirable time of day to photograph, i.e. blue sky days with a very harsh, high sun, you can really work around that and make the best of it because really you're not trying to capture a true representation of the landscape. You're trying to get an impression of the landscape. And that is whatever you feel it is. It's whatever you're feeling at that time that you're taking the image. And because of that, you have complete freedom, flexibility, mess around with colors, change split toning and color grading, change your white balance, just absolutely experiment until you see something that sort of resonates with you. So guys, I hope you found today's video helpful. Summer photography definitely doesn't have to be boring. There are tons of really creative and artistic ways that you can get involved with photography this summer. If you have enjoyed this video all around the debate surrounding art versus photography, then I would love to hear your thoughts on the subject down in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, do make sure to give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, do consider hitting the subscribe button and coming along for the next video. As always, thank you so much for watching and for your continued support, and I will see you all next Thursday for another video.